Welcome to episode 3 of Gambots. I'm your host, Eric, and this is my co-host,
Christian.
Today, we're going to be talking about the Urban Meyer Scandal at Ohio State. We are going to be talking about our thoughts on the first 3 episodes of Disenchantment. Christian saw Alpha this week. He's going to give us his opinion on that. I played the first episode of Tales from the Borderlands, so I'm going to talk about that a little bit. And finally, we're going to be playing our Amazon review game. But first, last week, Ohio State finally issued their findings on Urban Meyer's, which if you guys have not been paying attention, Urban Meyer has a coach on his staff by the name of Zach Smith, who has had domestic abuse allegations dogging him since 2009, and specifically in 2015 when he was working for Urban Meyer at Ohio State. And Zach Smith was finally fired in July of 2018. And former ESPN employee Brett McMurphy broke the case on the Urban Meyer story with his report of these abuse allegations. And the big crux of what ended up happening was on a media day, Urban Meyer was specifically asked about this situation, and he lied and said he had no idea what anyone was talking about. A few days later, Courtney, Smith's wife, the woman who had been making the allegations, came forward and said there's no way that Urban Meyer didn't know what had happened because she had texts with Urban Meyer's wife. And so this set off a big scandal a couple weeks ago. Urban Meyer was put on paid administrative leave by Ohio State until they determined what happened. And they finally released their findings last Wednesday, and ultimately the fate of Urban Meyer, which is they gave him a 3-game suspension. So, Christian, did you get a chance to check out this story?
Yeah, bits and pieces of it. Anybody that knows me knows I'm not the biggest sports fan in the world, but news like this kind of permeates everything. It's not just sports.
Yeah, it's one of those things that really transcend the sport itself, just because it's a big name program and it's scandalous. I mean, it's easy clicks for a lot of people, but that doesn't make the underlying issue of domestic abuse any less important. And really what I want to discuss today is what role should an employer have if there's domestic abuse allegations in their workplace? Should Urban Meyer have fired this guy immediately? Do you give second chances? What should have been done? And the next issue I want to talk about is ultimately Ohio State's decision to give Urban Meyer a 3-game suspension. So first, I'm just curious on your thoughts. If you were a boss and you find out one of your employees has allegations of domestic abuse, what do you think the appropriate action is?
I'm of 2 minds about this. I absolutely think that there should be consequences, and those consequences will definitely be served in a legal arena. As for your job, I really go back and forth. I think if it's somebody like this in a position of leadership, absolutely they should be removed from their position, because they're not just influencing their own actions at that point. They're influencing the actions of all the players that are on their team, or in other cases, all the other team members that might be working underneath them if they're not just a coach, but if they're somewhere else. I think if you're in a position of leadership, then you're held to a higher standard than you would be otherwise.
I agree with you. My big thing on this is, if you're Urban Meyer at that point, why do you keep Zach Smith around with these allegations? In their report, they say that they questioned the veracity of Courtney Smith's stories. They claim that she had come in and recanted her decision, her statements that Zach Smith had abused her, but she denies that claim. It's just one of those things. I think most people would agree that the legal ramifications, you deserve whatever you get after your day in court. But as a normal employee, generally, I don't think those should come into play. But when you're working around children, when you are a public-facing figure like this at one of the largest programs in the United States, you are held to a higher standard. People are sending their kids to you trusting you. And if it turns out that you're a wife beater, that just hurts your program in general. I don't know what was in Urban Meyer's head keeping that guy.
Yeah, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
So I think the stickier issue actually is what should be done to Urban Meyer, because he wasn't the one who perpetrated the abuse. I think if he had committed some form of domestic abuse, there's no question that he would be out at this point. But he was part of a cover-up to some extent, which sometimes is the cover-up worse than the crime. And then you get into the questions of what he knew at what times. What do you think should have happened to Urban Meyer? Do you think he should have kept his job? Do you think the suspension was a reasonable outcome for him?
I think it was somewhat reasonable. It doesn't appear that there was really much of an actual cover-up. It appears more like nothing was done in either direction. They didn't move to discipline him at all, but they also didn't move to try to hide anything. It just seems like Urban Meyer sat back and kind of said, not my pig, not my farm. I did read that when he was hired at Ohio State, Urban Meyer had already known about the 2009 incident and said that if you do this again, you're fired. But then it happened again, and it seemed like it didn't really matter to him at all.
Yeah, and here's my thing with Urban Meyer. I'm torn too, because from what everything sounds like, he followed the proper procedure. Whenever he heard about the abuse, he had informed his immediate superior. He looked into the police report, except then he takes the step of saying, I didn't really believe the allegations. It's not really his place to say what's right or wrong at that point. At the very least, he could have put this guy on administrative leave or something. I mean, why take the risk of keeping it out there when there's a time bomb like that, especially in this day and age with so much social media? If this story gets out, it's going to be a huge deal. Where my biggest issue with Urban Meyer comes up is actually once this report comes out, once he's asked about it at Media Day, and then he just starts lying. In the report that they released, there's indications that he spoke with other staff about deleting his phone records so they weren't more than a year old. So why he would do that is there's generally proper procedure to not keep any message over a year. It's a pretty common practice in corporations, especially with emails. But the idea that he's talking with someone about doing that, there's an implication that there's a cover-up, that maybe there were more incriminating texts to him. The one thing that I find hardest to believe, though, is that Shelley Meyer says, Courtney Smith told me, but I never told my husband, Urban. That doesn't make any sense. That if you're a married couple, you do not tell your husband that someone on your staff you seem to be relatively close with has been accused by their partner of domestic abuse.
Yeah, that's a little shaky. The text message deletion, even if it is standard procedure, is a little shaky. And now there's information coming out about maybe he did know about the 2015 incident, and he's saying that he didn't do anything because he didn't believe that the incident was legitimate, but then he was asked about it and denied that he ever had any information on it. So he's lying at least somewhere.
Yeah, and I think Ohio State's in sort of a precarious situation, right? Urban Meyer is a really good football coach, and their findings of fact do not come out and say he's a liar. For the Media Day issue, they claim he was on medication and he was under stress, so that's probably why he forgot. But they do say that it was a misrepresentation, but he lied. But I see why they keep him. I'm pretty sure at Urban Meyer's tenure at Ohio State, I think he's only lost 8 games, which is insane. I would guess Nick Saban is the only coach better than him in the win-loss category. And so I can see why they want to keep him. It's one of those issues. Who are you going to get? And then he could go to an opponent. But I think 3 games is a little bit of a weak punishment for him lying and being uncooperative to their investigation.
Yeah, I would agree with that, especially based on what I've been reading is that he's not really missing much of anything in those 3 games.
No, it's a bunch of – there's 2 cupcake games, and then I believe they play TCU, which should be a tough opponent. If I'm not mistaken, they're a top 25 team. The 4th week they play Penn State, which is their first big game of the season. And so it seems like they tailored it to do the suspension to do the least amount of damage possible to the program itself. I think if they really wanted to take a stance, he should have gotten a 4 or 5 game suspension. The only reason I actually don't think he's getting worse is because this doesn't really involve the NCAA. I don't think they take those things as lightly as schools do. But I mean, you have players who get larger suspensions for signing memorabilia of their own likeness, which is not even a crime. This guy turned a blind eye to a woman who was claiming that she was being abused, and he's taking a 3 game suspension. I'm not in the camp where I think he should have been fired, but I think they should have sent a stronger message of this is what we stand for. I mean, Urban Meyer goes up to his players every day and preaches integrity and honesty, and then it comes out that you yourself have no integrity and you're not honest. And when you're confronted with something horrible like this, your first instinct is to lie. I mean, they always say it's easy to be a good guy when times are easy, but when the chips are down, that's when your true character comes out. And Urban Meyer's true character has shown to be lackluster at best.
Yeah, it definitely seemed like a weaker response than he should have probably gotten.
Another issue that really irks me about this is if you watch the press conference, Urban Meyer comes out. He does not look like he's remorseful. It looks like that he's only saying this because he's required to. And then at the end, they don't even mention Courtney Smith at all. The woman who this story was about, it got entirely turned into a story about Urban Meyer, whereas the story should have been domestic abuse in a collegiate program and the program's response to that. But instead, it's about Urban Meyer. Do they keep him or not? And she just got washed out in all of this. And the only reason she was brought up was at the end. An ESPN reporter specifically asked about her. And Urban Meyer, they didn't mention her by name at all. They just did some generalized statement. And Urban Meyer did not release a statement about her until 2 days later on Friday. And I don't think is a great apology, which, have you seen that?
No, I have not actually.
Here's what he says. He says, "My words and demeanor on Wednesday did not show how seriously I take relationship violence. I sincerely apologize. I was taught at a very young age that if I ever hit a woman, I would be kicked out of the house and never welcomed back. I have the same rule in my house and in the football program at Ohio State. Over the years, we have worked hard to educate and remind coaches and players of the seriousness of relationship violence. I understand my lack of action in this situation has raised concerns about this commitment. I once again apologize for this, and I extend my empathy to all women, men, and families who are affected by relationship violence. This has been a real learning experience for me. I fully intend to use my voice more effectively to be part of the solution. Let me say here and now that I should have said on Wednesday. I sincerely apologize to Courtney Smith and her children for what they have gone through." So I'm glad he finally issued an apology, but he preferences the entire thing about his understanding and not just saying, "Look, I messed up. Sorry, Courtney Smith." It's not a horrible apology. It's not the "I'm sorry you're offended" apology, but it still seems like he's making it about himself.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. It seemed like it was 99% just the Urban Meyer show, and he just mentions Courtney Smith at the end because he doesn't want to get yelled at for forgetting her again.
What's hard to believe about this, too, is I imagine they're acquaintances in some way if, you're the wife of a coach that you work closely with. And just to turn a blind eye like this is hard to do. And I get he might have been in a tough situation. It seemed like he was a mentor to this guy. Maybe he didn't want to believe it. But when you're in the position of power, you got to make the hard choices sometimes.
Yeah, you would definitely think that they would have some kind of a relationship outside of the professional world. If this coach and assistant coach were as close as they seem like they were, and their wives were definitely close enough to text each other, and Courtney Smith definitely felt close enough to Shelley Meyer to reach out and talk to her about this specific issue, which I can't imagine would be a very easy thing to reach out and talk to somebody that you weren't really close with. I can't imagine being in a close relationship with somebody who's going through this and not doing anything about it.
Yeah. And you know what? I think at the end of the year, Ohio State's, this is either going to be swept under the rug or they're going to turn this into a redemption story for Urban Meyer after all the adversity he's faced of his own creation. This is all about him again and how winning football games somehow cures all moral deficiencies that you have.
Yeah, that certainly does seem to be the trend.
All right, so last week Disenchantment came out. Have you had a chance to watch much of it?
I've seen about 3 of the episodes. I'm part of the way into the 4th one right now.
All right, so the first 3 episodes are a princess, an elf, and a demon walk into a bar. Just the idea of this for our listeners who haven't seen Disenchantment, this is a Matt Groening cartoon. It stars Bean, who's voiced by Abby Jacobson, who the role I think most people know her from is Broad City. She's a princess of a rather decrepit kingdom. She's trying to avoid marriage. The other main characters are a demon that's sent to her that's more or less a bad influence, and then an elf who escapes a Keebler-style forest to come live in the real world, and he acts more like a moral compass to some degree. What did you think of the first episode?
I was really into it. I was really enjoying it. A lot of people have been saying it's not as good as Simpsons and Futurama, which it's definitely not, but it was never going to be. I mean, those 2 shows are basically legendary at this point, but it's still really funny.
One thing that I do like about this show is what they do really well is the background gags, where it's just shops that are either puns or references to something modern day, but into whatever time period it is, being at medieval times. I think those gags are really well done in this show.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So in the first episode, minor spoilers, we won't go too much into it, but I think my favorite character may have been Elfo, the Keebler elf style world he lived in where everyone was happy making candy, but then you juxtapose that to him banging the head elf's wife. I thought that was hilarious. That might have been my favorite part of the episode, is just where he came from.
I would say my favorite character is definitely Lucy, who is voiced by Eric Andre. He's the little demon, and I love everything that he does.
So we don't really want to spoil too much, but more or less, some things happen. Bean gets betrothed to a neighboring kingdom. She doesn't want to get married. The show's very much of she wants to be her own person, and that leads into the second episode. It's not like Futurama and Simpsons where each episode is a self-contained world, more or less. These ones, to some extent, flow into each other. So when episode 2 starts, it picks up where episode 1 left off. The crew goes on they take her husband to find mermaids to hopefully kill him. And the mermaids just end up being manatees or walruses. And then finally, in the third episode, more or less, the king believes that elf blood will give him immortality. He's trying to get that from Elfo and also trying to get Bean to act more princessly, which involves an exorcism. And you meet one of the first sort of antagonists of the series. And those are the first 3 episodes. What were your thoughts on them in general, Christian?
I really like them. Like you said, it's a continuous story arc, which is absolutely the opposite of Simpsons and Futurama, but I think it works. I'm typically much more a fan of a continuous story like that than I am of the one-off after one-off. But it felt to me like it was a version of The Princess Bride that was much more irreverent. And instead of there being another love interest, instead of wanting to marry him, she wants to just do her own thing. There's no other guy. It's just her wanting to do her own thing and her traveling around with these 2 crazy dudes.
One thing I find interesting about this, and maybe this happens in cartoons more than I realize, but each episode looks like it was written by a different person, and each episode also looks like it was directed by a different person, which I actually now in retrospect, you can see the differences as you watch them because each episode's not set up in the stereotypical plot points like Futurama or The Simpsons are because they're so episodic. But that's just something I found interesting when I was looking it up.
Yeah, that's not something that I'd noticed, but it's definitely, you're right. You can tell that there's a different style to the different episodes.
Overall, I like the show. I think it's a slow burn at first. I think they get better as they really find their footing and you establish the characters. One of the biggest complaints people had are these style of cartoons by Matt Groening has more or less character types where Bean is Layla, Elfo is very much like Fry, and Lucy's to some extent like Bender. But if you have archetypes that work, I don't see a problem with reusing them. Especially because I think they differentiate themselves enough where it's not a one-to-one comparison.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
So there's a total of 10 episodes. Do you think you're going to finish all of them?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'm definitely sucked in at this point. I just don't have as much time as I would like to devote to it.
Same. I'm about episode 6 right now, and I think it gets better. But overall, I'm a little bit higher on this than I've seen a lot of, at least YouTube critics. If you're going in expecting Futurama or Simpsons, you're going to be a little bit disappointed. I was going in hoping this would be essentially the fantasy Futurama, so the first episode disappointed me a bit. But as I kept watching it, I got into a different mindset, and I do like it for what it is.
I think the biggest thing that's hurting the show right now is just that. It's the expectation game. People expected it to be something that it's not, and when it isn't that, they're disappointed no matter how good the actual content is. So I agree. I think it is going to be like a slow burn. I think once people accept that it's not Futurama and it's not The Simpsons, I think they'll start to learn to enjoy it in its own right.
So this week you saw Alpha, which is a film directed by Albert Hughes. What were your thoughts on it?
I did. I actually just watched it last night. It was excellent.
So what's the general premise of it?
It takes place 20,000 years ago in what would eventually become Europe. It is about a tribe of Cro-Magnon hunters who have journeyed out to hunt bison, essentially. And one of them is the chief's son. It's his first hunt, and things go terribly wrong, and he gets separated from them, and they think he's dead, and so they leave. But then he wakes up, and he has to try and journey like the week and a half back to where the tribe lives, and the only way he can do that is by befriending a wolf that's been trying to kill him. And so it's really just supposed to be about the first time that humans and canines formed a symbiotic relationship with each other.
Is it a tense movie?
No, it's not very exciting. I will grant it that. It's slow in parts, but I didn't really mind. I thought it was good that it was framed that way. It's 90% just the journey home, and so it's interspersed with him trying to train this wolf to listen to him and to follow simple commands and to not try to steal food from him and all this other stuff. But the most interesting bit about it is that it's not in English. It's all subtitled, and it's all a fictional language.
That's interesting. Do you by chance know how they went about creating this fictional language?
So most of the movie was shot in British Columbia and around Vancouver. And so they teamed up with a linguistic anthropologist named Christine Schreier, who works at the University of British Columbia. And she took everything that they know about ancient languages, and she kind of reverse engineered this one so that it would sound like an actual language and it wouldn't just sound like gibberish. And so it's based on two very ancient languages called Proto-Nostratic and Proto-Eurasiatic. And she just built this language from that. And she's also worked on a couple other movies. She built the Kryptonian language for the Man of Steel movie, and she built the Eltarian language for the Power Ranger movie that just came out last year. But she said putting this language together for Alpha took her almost 2 years.
That is crazy to me. I can barely speak English, and just that someone more or less recreated a realistic language from 20,000 years ago is mind-blowing.
Yeah, so one of the leads, he's the chief in the movie. His name is Tau. His name in real life is Johannes Haukur Johannesson. He's Icelandic, and he speaks 4 languages. He speaks English, Icelandic, Faroese, and Danish. And he even said learning this was tricky, but after a little while, words and phrases started to jump out at him, and you could tell that it wasn't just thrown together in a week. It was something that she had worked really hard on, and it had the feel of an actual language. So the only other thing I would say about this movie is that it does a fairly good job recreating its time frame, not just in the language, but in the scenery and in just the peripheral things that go on. First of all, the cinematography in this movie is fantastic. They did a very good job. British Columbia looks like an extraordinarily beautiful place, if this movie is any indication. But they also included a lot of animals that would have been alive during this period in time, which is the middle of the Pleistocene. This actually takes place in the middle of the last ice age. So you see woolly mammoths, and you see woolly rhinos and saber-toothed tigers and dire wolves and all these animals that went extinct not long after this movie would have taken place. But 20,000 years ago, they absolutely would have been around, and that's absolutely what Cro-Magnon of the time would have been hunting. So it was neat to see them put this together so accurately, from the language to the scenery to the animals that were around. They did a really good job making this movie.
That's awesome, because this is not a time period you usually see in movies.
No, this is, like you said, this is a fairly uncharted time period for movie making, and they really nailed it. I think this is, if they do decide to make more in this time period moving forward, I think this is probably going to be the standard to shoot for.
So seeing if they make more, right now it has an 82% on Rotten Tomatoes. Its audience score is 79%, so they're pretty close. It had a budget of $51 million, and so far it's made back $27.5 million. So I imagine it will make back its budget at least.
Yeah, I think it will eventually. It came out number 5 nationwide. A lot of people have been turned off by the idea of it being in another language. I know at least at our theater, it wasn't really advertised anywhere. And so we've been trying to tell people as they've been going in, just so you know, this is not in English. And a lot of people have decided just not to bother. And I think that's a shame, because almost every person who went in and decided, I'm going to go for it anyway, almost every person came out saying that it was incredible, and I couldn't agree more.
That is true. A lot of people, for whatever reason, do not like reading subtitles, and that's why a large portion of the population don't watch foreign movies. It's just not something they like doing, which to each his own, but they do really miss out on some good movies when they decide not to just suck it up for 90 minutes and just read subtitles and get used to it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it goes back a little bit to what we were saying last week about not every story can be told by a white English-speaking cast. Sometimes you need to tell stories from other cultures, and when you do, sometimes those stories need to be told the right way.
Yeah. So this week, I was a little bit busy, so I did not get to platinum any games, but I did get to play the first episode in the Tales from the Borderlands series. Now, if you don't know what Tales from the Borderlands is, it comes from Telltale Games, which makes a very specific form of game. It's very story and narrative driven, and there's actually very little user input. So it's more like, I would say, like a choose your own adventure book, except your choices are not as consequential as in some other things. So you get to make choices, and it affects how characters react to you, but it doesn't necessarily change your final ending that much. Tales from the Borderlands is a sequel to Borderlands 2, but the Borderlands games themselves are a first-person shooter that really focus on collecting loot, like in Diablo, so you get new guns. And it's about a group of people called Vault Hunters who are trying to get rich and make treasures off of opening these vaults. It's in a cel-shaded graphics. It's a gorgeous game. It's hyper-violent. It's very fun. So it has a really big following. So they decided to do a Telltale version of the game. And I was initially very hesitant to check this out because I love the first Borderlands, and I was only lukewarm on the second one, which puts me in a minority because most people like the second one much more. So I didn't really want to try this one out, but I eventually did, and I'm really happy I did. At least the first episode was good. So it starts out sort of like an old Western where you're getting the perspective of two characters who hate each other, and their two stories form the whole story. So you'll play as one for one part of episode one, you'll play as the other character for part two, and so on, and you keep switching back and forth. And it's really interesting because they start out as enemies, their narratives don't really match up, and it's them calling each other out on it. And overall, for a Telltale game, if you like that type of game, I would say check it out. Zero from Borderlands 2 makes an appearance in this, so it's interesting to see how powerful the Vault Hunters are versus the standard person who's just walking around trying to survive in that world. And it has some very good comedic moments. If you're a fan of the Borderlands humor, you will definitely like the humor in this game. It's just there's no shooting, which is the primary draw of Borderlands.
All right, well, I guess that's pretty much everything we have content-wise for this week. I think we can return to the game that we played last week, though, with the Amazon 5-star review 20 questions format.
All right, I'm interested to see if I can guess what you picked.
All right, let's see. I've got 2 reviews here, but I'll start with my first. We've got a review by Jeff A. Strucker from Amazon, 5 stars, as always. And it says, I'm so very glad the ending was long. There were so many storyline debts to pay. Without each closure, we would have left the theater wondering, but what about this one? This monumental film retains the spirit as it was written, a worthwhile accomplishment. This is the Odyssey for our generation, a parallel civilization in crisis. In a word, epic.
Oh, God, Christian, this game's way harder than when I imagined it. I have no idea. So this is a movie, I'm gathering.
It is indeed a movie.
All right. It's a movie that's an odyssey of our times. Can you tell me what year this review was written? Or I guess decade. So is this like a mid-2000s odyssey, or is this a 2010, 90s? I just need the decade.
It is early 2000s.
All right. I'm going to have to ask for the second review. I have an idea, but I guess this is part 3.
It feels almost redundant to review this movie. How much promotion does it need? The movie earned $1.1 billion worldwide in its initial release, and it's the second highest grossing movie of all time. It nabbed 11 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. Certainly there are people who didn't like it. Some viewers simply aren't interested in this kind of story.
Yeah, I'm thinking Lord of the Rings 3.
It is indeed The Return of the King.
All right. When you said that decade, I was like, I'm feeling it had to be that, but for whatever reason, I was like, I don't know. I guess Harry Potter's ended later though, so. All right, guys. So that's our show. Thanks for joining us. What are you going to be consuming this week, Christian?
Well, Happy Time Murders came out, which seems like it's going to be Sausage Party, but with Muppets. So I'm probably going to check that out. It seems like it's going to be real strange. And other than that, I'm looking at finishing the first season of Disenchantment. I'm pretty excited to dive back into that again.
Yeah, this week I'm going to be checking out. I'm definitely finishing Disenchantment. I have 4 episodes left. And then my other project is I'm going to play episodes 2 through 5 of Tales from the Borderlands. So I'll most likely be talking about the rest of that next week. Well, guys, thanks for joining us. If you want to check us out on Twitter, we're at Gambots Network. All right, guys, thanks for listening.
Thank you.